Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:06 p.m. In a kind of a rather somewhat miserable Budapest, where I guess the spring or summer showers have begun, and so the rains are coming down. They come down quite strongly and quite suddenly, and so if you're like me and you keep your windows open all the time, and then when you go out, you don't bother to close them, then when you come home, you are in for an unpleasant surprise because, lo and behold, during the time that you were away, the the rain had come right through, and so that's that. So I see my good friend Marx 2023 says here the dollar has lost 6% of its value since Trump came to power. Oh no! Oh God, that is so terrible. Now, if you lose 6%, if your currency loses 6% of its value, then that's a pretty good thing. It means your exports are going to be doing well. There's really very little value to having a high value of your currency. All that does is, basically it makes your exports uncompetitive, and then your imports become, relatively cheap. So there's no great particular value in having an overvalued currency. Anyway, the deficit is now at a near time high for the first quarter. Only once before has it been higher. Trump is backing down. He's not backing down. I knew because Trump is not backing down. It's very important to keep this in mind. Trump has not removed a single one of the tariffs that he has imposed. The only thing Trump has withdrawn are hypothetical tariffs. He never imposed the reciprocal tariffs, he never imposed them. The 145% tariffs currently on China are still there. And they're not, and I mean, obviously they will go down, but they won't, but they're not going to go away. I mean, 145% was always unrealistic, but they're still there. You want to get away from, getting too carried away with all these kind of, CNN headlines, which are kind of usually, very gleeful about Trump. But the fact is that all of the tariffs that he has imposed, the tariffs on Mexico, the tariffs on Canada, the tariffs on China, the tariffs on aluminum and steel, the tariffs on auto parts, everything is still there. He hasn't removed anything. That doesn't mean that there won't be the 10% across the board tariffs. Everything is there. Now, there will obviously be negotiations. I mean, that stands to reason. There are going to be negotiations on trade. But that's that. It's China. China is slow. Let me read this out. Let me just. I can't. All right. It's very, very hard with this. All right. Yeah. So anyway, let me just. Yeah. Trump is backing down. No, he's not. Third concession by Trump. He's not. No concessions. He will lower some tariffs. Yeah. Obviously, the 145% is effectively a trade embargo. I mean, he didn't intend to impose a trade embargo on China, and China is slowly ramping up the pressure. Fake American. If you want to talk about fake American economy, it's the Chinese economy that's largely fake. But okay, that's fine. I mean, you want to hold to that position, and Trump will need to bail out the American farmers who have millions of unsold soy. I don't think so. As I said before, it's the state that's running completely unsustainable trade surpluses that will lose in any trade war, because that you can't run trade surpluses. You can't just keep doing it, and you're running trade surpluses with everybody, because sooner or later people are going to get fed up with it. And that's what all economists have always written, that trade surpluses are highly undesirable, and they completely make a mess of any world trading system. And what China has done through its various manipulation of the currency, subsidizing export, um, keeping wages down, keeping their welfare system down, keeping their consumption down, was unsustainable. And so they built up the trade surpluses, which they could do as long as other countries would put up with it. Well, they weren't. They weren't going to put up with it. And the reason why China will lose the trade war, as I think I've said, is that if they're locked out of the American market, which is their big, this is what they really depend upon, the American market. There isn't any other market that they can go into. The Europeans have already made clear that they're not going to act as a kind of market of last resort for China. South Korea and Japan have already said, we're not joining you in any united front against the United States. Anyway, I didn't want to talk about it just yet. We'll talk about China a little later. So what I really wanted to address is obviously, I think, the big news, which is the situation with Trump and Russia and Ukraine. So the media are writing quite extensive reports based on, obviously, pretty good sources, that the Trump administration has put forward a peace plan. They presented it to Russia, they presented it to Ukraine, and that this peace plan will, has a number of ingredients, much of which we pretty much had surmised before. I mean, obviously, the most important ingredient of the Trump peace plan is to freeze the conflict in place, where it is, at the line of contact, so where the Russians had got to in the four oblasts. You just basically freeze it there. So that we'd always known that would be a key part of the Trump plan. The other aspects to it, which are quite interesting and which we were a little bit surprised at. I mean, again, none of this has been confirmed. This is just simply newspapers. But for instance, that the United States would recognize the status of Crimea, that this Crimea is a part of the Russian Federation. The United States said they will recognize de jure. They would recognize it as legally part of the Russian Federation. So that's a surprising part of the plan. As far as the four oblasts, which is Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, the parts that Russia occupies, which is about 70% of Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporozhye, about 70%, and Lugansk is about 98, 99%. So that would be recognized de facto, not de jure, but de facto, as under Russian occupation. then there was another kind of surprising aspect, but though something that we talked about before, which was that the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye, which is currently under in the possession of the Russians, would be turned over to the Ukrainians, who would in turn hand it over to the Americans. The Americans would apparently run the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and provide electricity both to Russia and to Ukraine. Or I mean, I don't know whether it's to Russia necessarily, but at least to the part of Ukraine that the United States considers as under Russian occupation. So that's a surprising one. Russia would be asked to withdraw from Kherson in order to provide ready access to water from the Dnieper River to Ukraine. So again, that would be us a little surprising. Another part of the plan was that there would be the Americans would raise no objections to European peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers, inside Ukraine. And we know that the Russians strongly object to this. Let me just show you what the media report, and of course, obviously, no NATO membership for Ukraine. And here is the well. All right, let me first let me just set this up. So those are the stories, and then Zelenskyy kind of gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, in which he said, no, we can't possibly give up any territory. No way, no how can we give up Crimea. Now, this infuriated Trump, and he made the very reasonable point that, you kind of already lost it. I mean, you lost Crimea in 2014. I didn't have anything to do with that. The idea of blaming me for something that happened 11 years ago is it really is a little much. But that's the way. If you just follow the American media, that's the way they present it. That somehow Trump is betraying Ukraine because he's handing Crimea over to Putin. And they just say, yeah, but that happened 11 years ago, and the president at that time was Obama. So Trump had nothing to do with any of that. But nonetheless, the media presented it somehow, Trump is giving up Crimea. It's very important to consider what's really Trump is trying to do here. If let's say you're the president of the United States, and you're told, well, we've got this real commitment to Ukraine, and it's very, very important that Ukraine wins this war, defeats Russia. So if you're the president of the United States, well, the first question you ask is that, well, why is that really important for the United States? And then you get the blather, because we cannot possibly reward aggression, the rules-based order, international law will be violated, Ukraine's an innocent party, it was a sovereign state, invaded by an aggressive Russian state. So, okay, well, you've made that case. What's the plan for victory? And that really goes to the heart of it, because what is the plan for victory? You remember that was the famous question that then Clark Clifford asked Lyndon Johnson back in 1968. which is, well, what's the plan for victory? How do you intend to win this war? What do you need? What are you going to do that will secure victory? And Johnson couldn't really answer that question because he'd been, essentially it's to continue with what you were doing, but you didn't win. And that's really the point with Ukraine. You said, well, what's the plan? Well, of course, if you ask, Zelenskyy, and then Zelensky's enablers, all the NATO powers, they say the same thing, which is, well, if only we give them more arms, we give them more weapons, more artillery shells, more missiles, more drones, and give them lots and lots of money, then sooner or later Putin is going to come to the negotiating table. But that's it. That's the sum and substance of the strategy. Well, we do some more, and Putin will come to the negotiating table. The problem is that they've been saying that for more than 3 years. That's been said, and they haven't got Putin to the negotiating table. There was negotiations in Istanbul, but that's already more than 3 years ago. So they haven't got Putin to the negotiating table. There's absolutely no reason to believe that that Ukraine, which is a third of the size of Russia, maybe even less than that, maybe a quarter of the size of Russia, that Ukraine can defeat Russia. Cannot do it. So if Trump said, okay, well, if you can't do it, then we need to bring it to an end. And this, of course, has aroused this huge hysteria, through which you can see it throughout the media today. Trump is selling out Putin. Trump is betraying. Trump is selling out Ukraine to Putin. Trump is betraying Zelenskyy. Trump is betraying Ukraine. What a sellout! So this is all these chicken hawks, these cowardly creatures who sacrifice nothing of themselves, are sort of urging Trump to go on funding and fueling this war. But anyway, when so Zelenskyy, no, I can't do it. I can't recognize Crimea as Russia. Now, the other thing one has to say, and I'm sure people who listen to this podcast know the story. Crimea only ended up as being part of Ukraine entirely as fortuitously. It was a totally fortuitous development. Nikita Khrushchev had in 1954 transferred sovereignty over Crimea from the Soviet Republic, Russian Soviet Republic in the USSR, to the Ukraine Soviet Republic within the USSR. It didn't really matter that much since they were both members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But he did this really without any authority, and he just transferred it. So that was 1954, and then in that chaotic dissolution of the USSR, almost certainly illegal, not just almost certainly illegal, certainly unconstitutional. The Ukraine and Russia and Belarus just dissolved the USSR. They had no authority to do this. At the forest of Belovesh, they had no authority to do this. They just did it. They met and said, "Okay, the USSR doesn't exist anymore." Well, hey, what about constitutional norms? You don't just dissolve a state and say, "Well, it doesn't exist anymore." But at that moment, when they dissolved the USSR in December 1991, Crimea was under the sovereignty of Ukraine. So that's how somehow Crimea being an integral part of Ukraine came about. It was so two illegal acts. Khrushchev's handing of Crimea to Ukraine was clearly illegal, and at the very least, Khrushchev, in the best Bolshevik fashion, had not bothered to consult the people of Crimea as to where they wanted to be. Did they want to enjoy the sovereignty of Russia, or do they, or of Ukraine? They weren't consulted. As always in the Soviet Union. You were just picked up like a sack of potatoes and moved from one room to another. That's it. Like any sack of potatoes has no say in where it's going to be. So that was that. But then the dissolution of the USSR clearly didn't follow any kind of norms. And so Crimea ended up in Ukraine. Well, okay. I mean, Russia didn't do anything about that for many years. They let it go. But Ukraine's behavior, particularly the behavior following the Maidan coup, and the clear threats that the Maidan regime posed to Russian speakers, suggested to the Russians, well, that we no longer can accept this. This is no longer acceptable to us, and so therefore we need to do something to address the problem. None of that ever it appears in any of the media accounts, and Trump probably doesn't know much about it, but he kind of instinctively feels that this whole story that Crimea is an integral part of Ukraine and no one can possibly dissolve the bond between Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, he sort of feels, this is all pretty kind of nonsense. I mean, the Bolsheviks are always kind of moving people from one thing to another, changing borders. This region now belongs to that this republic. That region to that republic. These people are now reside in this republic. So all of that, it was just completely arbitrary actions which the Bolsheviks took, and which the West now pretends to be sacrosanct in accordance with international law, which of course they're not. So anyway, so that's why in the media, how can you possibly recognize Crimea as being anything other than an integral part of Ukraine, even though it wasn't. Ukraine was created in the aftermath of World War I by the Bolsheviks, and Crimea was not a part of Ukraine until 1954. But anyway, but Zelensky's bluster, saying that there's no way he could ever accept the loss of Crimea, that irked Trump, and so he sent out this truth yesterday, which of course again caused all this rage. Here we have Trump. He really isn't a great fan of Zelensky. He says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is boasting on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that, quote, Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. There's nothing to talk about here. This statement is very harmful to the peace negotiations with Russia, in that Crimea was lost years ago under the auspices of President Barack Hussein Obama, and is not even a point of discussion. Nobody is asking Zelensky to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, but if he wants Crimea, why didn't they fight for it 11 years ago when it was handed over to Russia without a shot being fired? And then he goes on. The area also houses, for many years before the Obama handover, major Russian submarine bases. It's inflammatory statements like Zelensky's that make it so difficult to settle this war. He has nothing to boast about. The situation for Ukraine is dire. He can have peace, or he can fight for another 3 years before losing the whole country. I have nothing to do with Russia, but have much to do with wanting to save, on average, 5,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers a week who are dying for no reason whatsoever. The statement made by Zelenskyy today will do nothing but prolong the killing field, and nobody wants that. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play should now finally get it done. I look forward to being able to help Ukraine and Russia get out of this complete and total mess that would never have started if I were president. Now, notice, first of all, here Trump is being very reasonable. He has made a distinctive turn in U.S. foreign policy, a distinctive turn on U.S. policy in Ukraine, from nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. We will fight to the end. We will never surrender to Putin. And now he's saying that that really my most important task, what I care about most now, is to bring this killing to an end. I don't see any purpose to it. No purpose whatsoever is served by this. It needs to come to an end. This is a major and very important declaration by a U.S. president. And instead of being commended, he gets attacked because apparently he's expected to go to war with Russia. But this is, we hardly need to repeat it, that this whole idea that we can go on fighting this war and yet at the same time not fighting it. So yeah, we got to take on Putin. We got to fight Putin. We're going to resist Putin. But you do it. We'll hold your jacket for you. Because of course, these Western journalists, these Western powers, the Western governments, they have no intention of themselves getting involved in this fighting, and they made this clear for the past 3 years that they have no intention at all of going to war against Russia. Quite rightly, because it's a fool's errand to go to war against a nuclear superpower. It's not a war you can win. But instead of accepting that, well, since we're not going to go to war against Russia, then we need to bring this war to an end. But no, we're going to do it. But of course, it'll be somebody else who will get killed. And Zelenskyy seems ready. Yeah. We're ready to go and sacrifice ourselves in this futile war. So Trump should be commended for essentially saying, I just want this war to end. And I'm just trying to find some kind of a solution that both sides can accept and sign on to. It's like, basically a compromise. No one's happy, no one gets what they want, but at least it brings the fighting to an end. And so this, it is quite an extraordinary that Trump is getting attacked for this, for doing, he's selling someone out. How are you selling anyone out? By saying, this war needs to end, and basically neither the Americans, nor the French, nor the Germans, nor the Poles, no one is willing to go out and put their lives on the line for the sake of Ukraine. Well, if that's the case, then the war needs to come to an end. Now, then today, Trump, in order to balance things out, came out and spoke harshly against Putin, because there was a bombing yesterday of Kiev. And he says, I'm not happy with the Russian strikes on Kiev. Not necessary and very bad timing, Vladimir. Stop. 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Let's get the peace deal done. Okay, I think that's very reasonable. Wants to get it done. Now, so this is the Telegraph, which says, Trump to let Putin keep land seized from Ukraine. Now, what you have to keep in mind here is it isn't up to Trump to let anyone keep. I mean, the only way you have any chance of getting Putin to disgorge the land seized from Ukraine, the only way is to go to war. So it isn't up to Trump to, the whole idea that Trump is just going to stop this. There's only way you can stop it is if you go to war. Trump has no intention of going to war. And nobody wants to go to war. So therefore the whole idea, he's letting him do it. No, 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 I'm not going to let him. No, let's just go on waging this war. But the land is still going to be in the hands of Russia. We can go on waging it for another year, 2 years, 3 years. Kill, I don't know how many more hundreds of thousands of people. But the land will still be in the hands of Russia. And here we have Donald Trump will let Vladimir Putin keep almost all the territory he has seized. Let him, it's up to Trump to do this. All the land he has seized from Ukraine under the terms of a proposed peace deal. The condition is part of a 7-point plan to end the war that leaves Ukraine with no clear U.S. security guarantee. It will be discussed in London on Wednesday, when U.S. officials will hear Kiev's reaction. The proposal involves the U.S. offering formal recognition of Crimea and implies de facto recognition of the other occupied territories. The plan does include some changes in Ukraine's favor. Russia would give up 2 small areas currently occupied by its troops. And then this is small areas like in Kharkov, and then in Kherson, and Ukraine would regain unhindered access to the mouth of the Dnieper River, and Russia would withdraw from a second area of Kherson province. And then point 3 requires Ukraine to refrain from seeking membership of NATO, though the country would still be free to join the EU. European countries could deploy an assurance force to deter Putin from invading again. But the Telegraph understands that the plan does not commit the U.S. to guarantee the security of any such deployment. And then, of course, he says, so Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, previously said that no European force could be sent to Ukraine without an American backstop. So that's a very important point. So, they say in theory, yeah, well, no problem at all about European peacekeepers. But the British have already said, well, we're not going to go in as peacekeepers unless there's an American backstop. And the Americans have said, well, we're not going to act as a backstop. And well, that leaves just the French. I mean, the French, Macron saying, yeah, well, we're going to send them in, but the French aren't going to do it without the British. I have my doubts whether the Germans are going to go in. The Poles have already ruled out going in. The Italians have ruled out going in. So it can't happen. So therefore, this could be part of an agreement. Yeah, sure. Put some Europeans in as the peacekeepers. But since once the British have said we're not going in without the American backstop, then that's pretty much it. Then I don't see how you can have any kind of the deployment. So, in a way, if Russia does accept this, and we don't yet know exactly. I mean, the Russians have been quite taciturn. So the Americans are saying, well, we're close to an agreement. We're talking intensely with Russia and so on. But the Russians haven't said anything very much. So we don't yet know. I should say, incidentally, that I think Russia should accept this deal. I absolutely think Russia should accept this deal. Um, originally back in 2022, I wanted Russia to go all in, crush the Kiev regime, and do regime change, install a kind of a pro-Russian friendly government, and that would solve its particular problem with Ukraine and NATO. and when the whole so-called special military operation started, that seemed the most reasonable strategy. That okay, well, we went in order to effect a regime change in your favor, and I likened it to what the Soviet Union did in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in '68. That this there each time they intervened, not in order to seize any territory, but in order to remove an annoyance that a government in Budapest and then in Prague that was out of line. That was simply not favoring Soviet policies, and that's kind of what I thought they were trying to do in 2022, but that didn't happen. For whatever reason, Russians didn't achieve it. They did. I think that it was a half-baked attack on Kiev, and when they surrounded Kiev, but then they withdrew. Once they withdrew from the perimeters of Kiev and then moved back into the the Donbass, then the whole regime change operation really came to an end. And then the war became a little more puzzling as to what exactly Russia was now trying to accomplish, other than, I guess, incorporating territories of Ukraine into the Russian Federation. It's like they said, okay, well, we failed to accomplish a regime change, but we will nonetheless punish you. We will punish Ukraine by taking away a large chunk of its territory. So essentially, the war kind of dragged on. Now, the reason I say that Russia should accept this deal is that the alternatives are quite bleak. It means the war in the Donbass and in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia would just go on. Well, this has been going on for 3 years. Very heavy casualties sustained by Russia, and if Russia really, basically does turn, shows Trump the finger and said we're not interested in your plan, then the United States will redouble its assistance to Ukraine now, and then of course everybody else, all the other NATO member states, they'll also redouble their efforts on behalf of Ukraine, rejoicing that the whole gang is together again. We're all united once more. We're all backing Ukraine, and so we've got to do everything we can to stymie Russia. That would be so. In other words, it's already difficult enough making progress in Ukraine for Russia. It's going to be even more difficult if Russia says no. Now, we said, oh, but Russia will defeat Ukraine. Russia can defeat Ukraine. Okay. Russia probably can defeat Ukraine. Russia will probably can go on fighting, and Russia will eventually defeat Ukraine. But at what cost? Now, then they say, oh, yeah, but Ukraine's on the brink of collapse. The problem is we've been hearing that for more than 3 years. Ukraine's been on the brink of collapse since February 2022. We were told right at the beginning, February 2022, that Ukraine's on the brink of collapse. And it hasn't happened. So there's no reason to assume that it's likely to happen anytime soon. And that also means the war could go on for another 2-3 years. So the all the way with Russia crowd are in a way they're similar. They have there's a sort of symmetry between them and the sort of we got to support Kiev, because they both just wanted this war to go on, while they themselves are not risking anything. Yeah, I gotta go because Russia can't possibly give up. Russia must go on fighting. Um, Even though, again, with a view to what? With a view to gaining a little more territory, so they will gain what 23, 24% of Ukraine. Now they might say, "Oh yeah, but they can still generate regime change in Kiev. That could still happen." Well, maybe it can happen, but I have my doubts whether that's going to happen. The one reason why I have doubts that that will happen is that the United States and NATO are quite emboldened now. They were quite timid in 2022. Initially, they were quite timid. They thought Russia would win this war pretty easily, and they were quite reticent initially to get involved. If now Russians were to make a big move against Kiev and to take out Zelenskyy and his crowd, I wouldn't discount the possibility of a much more serious NATO involvement. NATO has lost its fear of Russia. That's kind of the problem. NATO was still afraid of Russia in 2022. It isn't now. So that would be a high risk strategy to try to go, once again at Kiev. The moment was then. I mean, no question. The moment was in February 2022. That was the time to knock out Kiev. Ideally, it should have been done in 2014, but now I think it's a little more difficult. Anyway, let's just continue with that that story. And so then this is point 4. This is still the 7-point peace plan. Point 4 covers territory with America offering de jure recognition of Crimea. Recognizing Russian control of Crimea would violate the central principle of international law and the post-1945 world order that no country can annex the territory of another. If land is seized, then no nation is supposed to recognize this change. This, of course, is utter balls, needless to say. One should remember that what happened in Yugoslavia was unilateral secessions. Now, you're not supposed to recognize unilateral secessions. Unilateral secessions means republics declared independence and violated the sovereignty of the state, the territorial integrity of the state. They violated the rulings of the state's constitutional courts that had declared secessions illegal, and the Western powers rushed to recognize the secession state. And so that was the secessions. Then, of course, there was the case of Kosovo. Kosovo was stolen outright. Boom, theft in plain sight when NATO bombed Serbia and forced the Serbs essentially to surrender Kosovo to NATO. NATO then created its own fake artificial state, and then when this fake artificial state of Kosovo declared independence, again, totally unilaterally, the NATO states, and indeed not even all of them, not all of the NATO states, recognized its independence. So one can't really go do this whole post 1940. Israel has occupied territory, annexed territory, and the United States has recognized its the annexation of the Golan Heights. United States has recognized Israel's occupation of Jerusalem, all in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and and no one does much about it. Now, Turkey has been occupying Cyprus for 50 years now. I mean, admittedly, no one has recognized it, but no one's doing anything about it either. So it's not exactly anyone's getting very agitated. Wow, look at this the situation in Cyprus is just it's unacceptable. So no, um, this is all just ridiculous posturing. As I said before, the case of Crimea was had nothing to do with democracy, had nothing to do with sovereignty. It was entirely an accident of history that Crimea ended up under the tutelage of Ukraine. There was a referendum there. I don't think anyone really thinks that there was anything wrong with that referendum. I don't think anyone really thinks that there's a majority of the population in Crimea that wants to return to Ukraine. So that's just all a lot of nonsense. And the media want to go on with this somehow. Oh, Crimea is being sold out by Trump. Anyway, let's go on with this. And then that this is this. The proposal would freeze the front line, allowing Putin to keep almost all of those gains. It would not formally recognize these occupied territories as being part of Russia, but the Telegraph understands that the proposal implies de facto U.S. recognition, and as well as some territory switching hands to Ukraine. The nuclear power station of Zaporozhye would be transferred to American control. I don't get. I still. I think I'm missing something on this. I don't quite understand why the Americans want that Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I don't know. There may be something there that needs to be fleshed out. Under point 6, Ukraine would sign the mineral deal, because allowing U.S. companies access to country's natural resources. And then point 7 raises the possibility of new relations between America and Russia, saying that all sanctions would be lifted and the two countries could begin to cooperate on energy. And then here's the Financial Times, which is 7 long. Then here, blah, blah, much the same. About Crimea. But he says here, the proposal is the first formal indication Putin has given since the war's early months 3 years ago that Russia would step back from its maximalist demand to end the invasion. Well, we don't know that, because again, Russia hasn't given any kind of public statement on these stories either way. And then then it says the U.S. proposals include deploying a European peacekeeping contingent in Ukraine, as well as separate non-NATO military force to help monitor a ceasefire. And then the force would work jointly with Ukrainian and Russian forces, monitoring the armistice. And then under a potential deal, Ukraine would pledge not to retake Russian-occupied territory by force, while Russia would agree to halt its army's slow advance. And then that says it's unclear whether Trump has asked Ukraine to formally recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea. Well, the truth by Trump suggests that he doesn't expect Ukraine to recognize. It would just be an American thing. And then, but people familiar with the matter said Putin would potentially be prepared to give ground on his previous demand for full control over the 4 frontline Ukrainian regions if the U.S. made broad geopolitical concessions to Moscow, such as recognizing its control of Crimea and barring Ukraine from joining NATO. Okay, so the question is it? I mean, Ukraine obviously isn't very happy. At least the Ukrainian regime isn't very happy about accepting this. It would mean loss of maybe 20% of its territory. It would mean, essentially, as far as the Americans are concerned, giving up on Crimea, and uh, and so that, that's obviously a blow. Now the problem for Ukraine, and Trump alluded to this in his Truth, is that Ukraine doesn't really have a particularly strong hand to play, in that Ukraine is wholly dependent on the United States, and to a lesser extent on Europe. So if the United States were to walk away in exasperation, it's very hard to see how Ukraine can go on fighting. I mean, the Europeans would try to pick up the slack, but there's just no way that they could do it. So obviously, Ukraine, Zelenskyy and his crew, are not happy with it. Now, the question then is, well, what about the Russians? What do the Russians gain from this? Now, the sort of the onto Kiev crowd will say, well, we're not interested in any of this. We're going to march on towards victory. We're just going to keep marching on to victory. Now, there are some problems with that position. I mean, first, as I said, that could take a long time, and a lot of people are going to get killed between now and this final victory. And as long as a war is going on, then there are all sorts of risks, all sorts of things can happen. I mean, wars inherently very, very unpredictable. This is the insight of Clausewitz. You want to finish a war very quickly because you just don't know all the things that could happen. Now, that's one aspect of it. I mean, but the other aspect of it is Russia being offered a deal now that's that's actually quite attractive? Well, one part of this deal, which obviously is quite attractive, is the friendship, which is quite an extraordinary thing, a friendship that is being offered by Trump. Now, if Russia were to say, okay, no, we're not interested, we're going to continue with the war, you will incur the enmity of Trump, and Trump will then do everything he can in order to make Russian military progress in Ukraine as difficult and as bloody as possible. So that he's obviously would do that, but he will also essentially put paid to any hope Russia would have for any kind of improvement in relation with the West. Because, yes, the friendship that is being extended by Trump, that's unique to the United States. This doesn't Europe is not going to do this. Europe is not going to offer any kind of friendship. But nonetheless, Europe isn't that important. I mean, it's if the United States extends some kind of partnership or whatever, then eventually the Europeans are going to come around. It's going to take time, but eventually they'll come around, and they usually do. But if Russia says no, we're just going to go on, then okay, then they go on fighting, and then fighting, but then with a view to what? What happens? What happens when you finally defeated Ukraine? What have you achieved? You've got an absolutely monolithic block of NATO arrayed against you. And even these doubting voices within NATO, such as the voice of Viktor Orban or Robert Fico, may just then say, well, if Russia isn't really interested in bringing this to an end, then we're just going to align with NATO. And other countries might follow, the sort of the global South or the global majority, which has not been particularly critical of Russia in all of this, but they might at this stage, because they might look at this peace plan and say, it's not unreasonable. it's they're basically saying, you've got, we'll de facto recognize um, your military accomplishments of the past 3 years. We'll give you legal recognition of Crimea. We're going to offer you some kind of a partnership, economic partnerships, and on energy and so on. Um, they're saying, well, that's just not an unreasonable deal. If you go on fighting, then you basically got you've achieved defeat of Kiev, and I don't even know what that would mean, how that would be accomplished, and what that would look like. But you're going to have this block in unremitting hostility against you. Now the alternative, that but an argument against that would be, well, all right, that's Trump, but Trump isn't going to be there forever, and then whoever comes after him will resume the hostility towards Russia. This is just Trump. Well, that may be true. Um, but if that's going to be the criterion, then no war can ever come to an end. If it's always going to be the case, well, yeah, but that's okay with him, but what happens afterwards? And it's possible, yeah, the West will immediately break its word and relaunch the war. That could happen. But the problem is that, okay, that could happen. So now so let's have the war now. Let's just keep this war going now, because the hypothesis that somehow Ukraine will collapse sometime in the very near future, and then NATO is going to collapse, and then NATO will surrender and say, that's it, you beat us, you defeated us. The chances of that are very slim. NATO's not going to declare itself to be defeated. So ultimately, you have to say, you haven't accomplished your goals, and Russia hasn't accomplished its goals, but you've accomplished something, and therefore it makes sense, really, to bring a war to an end. I mean, that's I mean, I mean, Russia has had more than 3 years to win this war. It didn't do it. Well, now you got to think about something else. Got to have a different plan of action. I know people will disagree with me, and I might have also taken that same line 3 years ago. But now I just don't really see what advantage is to be gained by keeping this war going, and particularly as there's really a fairly positive atmosphere in Washington. I mean, Trump has definitely shifted the goalposts on this. Now, everyone will say, no, it's exactly the same thing. Biden, Trump, Obama, it doesn't matter. It's all the same. They're all the same. And Russia must just go forward, do whatever it needs to do, and so on. As I say, I don't see it. Anyway, there's one more story, I think, here that this is from Bloomberg, and that one of the things that Trump is apparently asking of the Russians, U.S. to demand Putin accept Ukraine's right to military force. It says the U.S. will demand that Russia accept Ukraine's right to have its own army and defense industry as part of a peace agreement between Moscow and Kiev. And then U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff is expected to raise the issue with Russian President Vladimir Putin when they next meet. Um, well, I mean, they could have their own army, but there would probably have to be some numerical limits, and there would obviously have to be restrictions on foreign military bases. I mean, that would have to be in any part of agreement. There have to be limits on foreign military bases in Ukraine. Agreeing to let Kiev have an adequately equipped and manned army as demanded by Ukraine and European allies would mean Putin would have to give up on his goal for Ukraine's demilitarization. Well, I mean, demilitarization from what it is now, but there shouldn't be a problem in allowing Ukraine to have a military, that can guard its borders, but they cannot launch any kind of uh, major military operations. And certainly, there would have to be absolute limits on the presence of foreign military personnel. It's a sign that the Trump administration is seeking some concessions on the Kremlin as well as Ukraine as it tries to end a war that's now into its fourth year. And then says the Trump administration also wants Moscow to rely. Yeah, this is the Zaporozhye, and that's it. So that's that. Again, that is, I think that's doable. The peacekeeping element, I would have thought it's doable because I think they could ask for peacekeepers from neutral countries. I mean, if it's, they could bring them in under United Nations auspices, so they could bring in forces from other parts of the world, so I think that can be done, particularly as Keir Starmer has more or less indicated that he's not going to send in British forces without the American backstop, and the Americans have said that they're not going to do it. So that was done. So the question then is, will this work? Well, Steve Witkoff is going to Moscow on Friday, so that's his fourth meeting with Putin. So you'd have to say, at the very least, something is up. I mean, they're clearly negotiating something. They're not going to be sitting there discussing their favorite scotches. So they're obviously discussing something. I mean, the pessimist in me says, it isn't going to work. And I think that a lot of forces that are arrayed against a peace. I think there's about one chance in three that this will work. But I wanted to say, and why I've been talking about it, is that I think Trump should be commended for doing this, and I think the people from all sides who are attacking him, I think they're missing the plot. He hasn't. I don't think he's done anything at all wrong, and so and he's gone completely against his predecessor's policy. He's gone against the NATO current policy. So I think it's anyway. Let's take the one other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit, but maybe on another time, is the current state of play in Kashmir with this between India and Pakistan. I've always thought I've been kind of interested over the years in the breakup of the Indian subcontinent. I mean, the British clearly made a complete utter hash of it when they partitioned the subcontinent. But the prize there was Kashmir, and Now, India's claim on, I'm talking about Kashmir obviously because of this recent terrorist incident, which has now led to escalation between India and Pakistan. Clearly, Modi is issuing threats. He's alleging that behind these terrorists is the Pakistani intelligence service. We don't know, but not. I wouldn't. I wouldn't rule that out right away. The Pakistan is denying this, but they have. We know that the Pakistan intelligence service has in the past supported, financed, armed all kinds of terrorist groups um, all over the world, incidentally, but particularly in Kashmir. Now, the Kashmir always, clearly was a very, very beautiful part of the world, and India and Pakistan have their claims on it, and China as well. But India, I always thought had the stronger um, claim to it because basically the Maharaja had acceded to India really prior to the partition, and and Pakistan's claim to Kashmir is really largely on the basis of demography. So it's not unlike the Kosovo Albanian case, which is clearly Kosovo is historically a part of Serbia, but for a variety of reasons through demography, gradually it became a Muslim majority province. So same thing happened in Kashmir after time, and again something that was fueled by Pakistan. That Kashmir became Muslim majority, and once it became Muslim majority, then they started making claims that Kashmir should be a part of Pakistan. So though legally, there's no question. Legally, it belongs to India, um, and so there's basically kind of a line of contact between the Pakistan part of Kashmir and the Indian part of Kashmir, and but up until 2019, in Kashmir had had its own kind of special status. So it was it had a kind of autonomy. It was part of India, but it enjoyed a certain autonomy, and that the laws of India didn't automatically apply to Kashmir. One should say, incidentally, that in India and Pakistan really have fought already two wars over Kashmir. I mean, they fought it at the time of the partition and the independence of Pakistan, and then of course there was another war in the 1960s, 1965, which India won because India obviously is the much greater power. Um, but nonetheless, India has tolerated Pakistan's presence there, and and the sort of de facto partition of Kashmir. So in effect, I mean, Kashmir is supposed to be a part of India, even though it's de facto. Some of it is in the possession of Pakistan, and some of it is in the possession of China. And India has been quite reasonable about this. The agitation has all come from Pakistan. And now, back in 2019, Modi essentially cancelled the Section 370 of India's constitution. That's the one that guaranteed the autonomy of Kashmir. So, in effect, Kashmir was now fully integrated within India, and of course, all these, Pakistan got very, very agitated about this. I remember I was once I was invited onto some Pakistan broadcast. Um, I can't remember the name of it, and they expected me to side with them, and so they started ranting and raving. Everyone on the panel started ranting and raving about genocide, genocide, genocide. This is genocide against. And it wasn't clear against genocide against whom? Against the Kashmiris, the Muslims, Pakistan, or whatever. It was genocide anyway. This is Indian. India was committing genocide because it had rescinded this Article 370. And then I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I think India certainly has a case. Pakistan has a case. India's case is based on the law. Pakistan, has a certain case. I mean, there's the demography. Obviously, there's a majority. It's now a majority Muslim province. But there was supposed to be. It's true. There was supposed to be a plebiscite held in Kashmir, but it never happened because Pakistan hadn't withdrawn its forces. I mean, there couldn't be a plebiscite in Kashmir until Pakistan withdrew its forces. This was soon after 1948. So and the moment I said that, boom, I became the skunk at the Tea Party. It's completely ignored. The discussion went on for another 25 minutes, and not once did the moderator turn to me, hey, would you like to add something? So they all just kept repeating genocide, genocide, genocide. So it kind of, it wasn't terribly persuasive, and I don't think Pakistan's case for Kashmir is particularly persuasive. The question is, what happens now? I mean, it's because I always kind of wondered, that given India's claim for Kashmir and why it's, and the fact that it regards this that basically this de facto possession of part of Kashmir by Pakistan. I mean, obviously, it's Pakistan occupying sovereign Indian territory. And I sort of, well, why doesn't India do something about it? Why does it just simply drive the Pakistanis out? I mean, it's not like there's any love lost, and it's not like India would ever lose a war against Pakistan. I mean, it's so much bigger and stronger. But maybe it's a certain caution that's come about through both sides possessing nuclear weapons, and so you can't really. Neither side particularly wants to go down the path of going to war, as they did in 1971 over. Well, it was East Pakistan or East Bengal in the old parlance of the empire. So they did go, but that was 1971, before either India or Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons. So who knows whether that war would have taken place had each side possessed nuclear weapons. So Modi is sounding very tough and issuing threats. There have been expulsions of diplomats on both sides. A kind of a water agreement between India and Pakistan signed soon after the partition. This water agreement has now been put in abeyance. India has basically put it in abeyance. Pakistan said that if you start messing around with our water supply, that's an act of war, which I guess it is. And Pakistan has put in abeyance the 1972 peace treaty that ended the war between India and Pakistan in 1971. So it'll be quite interesting how far this goes. I tend to think that they'll pull back. They're not going to start exchanging missiles. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting when you have two nuclear powers, um, seriously threatening one another. Anyway, let's take a look at what the Gagglers are saying. These are the people who are trying to keep the dogs in trying to keep them happy, because these dogs, when they're not happy, and I've said this so many times before, they're not happy, they just go straight for my throat. I mean, it's just they don't have any compunction about that. They have that savagery. um Anyway, Marx 2023 says, George, you were on bullhorns. You said that if Trump pulls away from Ukraine, it will seem that America lost the Ukraine war. When I said that America has been defeated in Ukraine, you were having none of it. Which is it? All right, that's a good question. I don't think I said it quite in that way. What I said was that if um, Trump says, "Okay, I'm giving up, I'm walking away," then this will be, and basically, I'm not going to give anything more to Ukraine. Ukraine goes down to defeat, which I think would be a reasonable outcome. Um, but I don't think it'll happen. But if he were to do that, if because that's what we were talking about last week in relation to the Marco Rubio and Trump threat. Well, if we don't get a deal, we're just going to walk away, and nobody knew exactly what that meant. Did that mean you're going to just walk away from this attempting to negotiate a peace, or you're going to walk away from Ukraine? So what I said was that if Trump abandons Ukraine, in other words, and then Ukraine goes down to defeat with Russia, then this will be interpreted as because the United States will have abandoned Ukraine. That action by the United States of abandoning Ukraine will be said, well, that was a defeat for the United States. Now, when people say America has been defeated in Ukraine, then that, of course, I disagree with. Of course, America hasn't been defeated in Ukraine, because basically, I mean, America has been able to keep this fight going without breaking a sweat, without losing any American lives. It's Russia that has lost lives, Ukraine that has lost lives. So by itself, of course, it's not right. Of course, it's not right to say that America has lost the war. But if you just say, okay, well, we're walking away, and then Ukraine just collapses and goes down to defeat, then yeah, I mean, obviously, that without any kind of an agreement in place, this will be interpreted as a defeat for NATO. I don't think it'll be a fatal defeat. That I definitely disagree with those who say that, oh well, that'll be the end of NATO. It's not going to be the end of NATO. It'll just simply be a setback, and on the contrary, it will only lead to a re-energized NATO, remilitarized Europe, militarized continent. Everyone's going to start forking over 3, 4, 5% of their GDP for military purposes. So there's going to be that. But just in terms of Ukraine, I mean, there's no question. I mean, if after you've put in all this effort, America will have at least sent all these arms, and then you say, well, now it's now you've abandoned it, then yeah, then it will seem like it's been a defeat for NATO. But as things stand now, no, of course not. I don't think America has been defeated. So I mean that's kind of I mean, I don't know. It's hard to explain it in very in the few minutes that you have on the bullhorns. But that's more or less what I said. That if that were the circumstances in which um, you simply walk away, then it's like you have a project. If you have a project and then you walk away from your project, then you say, well, you failed. I mean, you had a project, you were supposed to complete it, you didn't complete it, well, you failed. But that hasn't happened yet. So and I would look upon it and say, yeah, okay, good. It's you failed this project. This was a stupid, lousy project to do, but nonetheless, however stupid and lousy the project was, you failed in that project. Anyway, Vic Shakapopoulos said, George, I believe the current results of the movie Night Poll are a consequence of Russian interference. Damn! Apocalypse Now and the Deer Hunter winning would be a great threat to our democracy. Consider taking the case to the Romanian Constitutional Court or something. It's very interesting that the deer. I didn't think that the Deer Hunter would take a lead. I mean, I wasn't sure um, who would win the poll. I guess I thought, if I was putting a bet, I thought Platoon would probably come out ahead, or maybe Good Morning Vietnam. I mean, Platoon, I think, probably is the best known of that. It's kind of interesting because the Apocalypse Now and the Deer Hunter came out at about the same time, kind of the late 70s, and while obviously they were set in Vietnam, they weren't strictly speaking about the Vietnam War. I mean, the Deer Hunter was more about, I think the immigrant experience in the United States. Somehow this purity and idealism of Americans being betrayed in Vietnam. Um, and so and Apocalypse Now that was obviously a similar idea. Somehow America becoming corrupted by the Vietnamese. So in much the same way as in the Deer Hunter, somehow Americans are kind of pure, nice, decent, moral, but they're corrupted in the jungles of Southeast Asia, particularly by the corrupt Vietnamese or French culture. So that was kind of similar in some ways, Apocalypse Now and the Deer Hunter. But then there was this, so that was late 70s, and then there wasn't too much going on for about 7 or 8 years, until the kind of mid to late 80s, when there was another flurry of Vietnam movies. And those movies, where I thought, I mean, that would be Platoon, Hamburger Hill, and then the Kubrick film, which I didn't include because I thought it was just so lousy, the Full Metal Jacket. But also, I think all three came out around the same time, 87, 88, so about 10 years later. And while there were more, or at least Hamburger Hill and Platoon were actually dealt with the war, specifically with the war. And Good Morning Vietnam also around the same time. So they actually dealt with the war. Full Metal Jacket, I have no idea what the hell that was about. That was just somehow Kubrick's meditation on violence or something. But I thought it was one of Kubrick's weakest films. Um, but I thought aesthetically these films were less interesting than The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now, though thematically I think they were actually more about Vietnam than either of those films. They actually dealt with the war and the people in the war, what was going on in the war, and so on. Funny enough, in other film which also came out of that around that time was the Hanoi Hilton, and now the Hanoi Hilton. I didn't include that in the poll. I can. There's only 8 films that I can do on locals, but the Hanoi Hilton was a particularly controversial because, of course, that was very much against the peaceniks, the American peaceniks, who were seen to be betraying America and Vietnam, and particularly, the peaceniks who came to visit the prisoners of war um, being held in Vietnam, in particular the sort of Jane Fonda types. That's what it was called. The Hanoi Hilton was really about the North Vietnamese prisons, which held American POWs. And so that was the one that really caused a lot of aggravation. That wasn't a very good film, I think, and it was very polemical, obviously, about the peaceniks, but it wasn't a particularly good film. So, I I I could have done more, but there just wasn't enough space. But I am surprised that the Deer Hunter seems to have taken probably a unsurpassed lead. I think probably the Deer Hunter is going to come in first, unless people are welcome to vote. Keep voting and see if somebody else can do it. Robert, always good to see you. Robert has 80 degrees Fahrenheit in New Jersey. Yeah, yeah, lucky man. New Jersey. Um, uh, 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 so Mark says America has very few exports. Get real, George. America's an importer. That's more expensive, lots of times. Well, the thing is that you can't have it both ways. You can't continually berate America, trash the American economy, and at the same time trash a government that is trying to do something about it. I mean, you're going to make up your mind. I mean, if you have America clearly does have a problem. You can't go on running huge trade deficits. America has done this for many, many years, and the trade deficit has grown and grown. And with it is, of course, the budget deficit, trade deficit, they're obviously connected. The America's debt continues to grow, and as COVID and other events that came along have shown that somehow America has been too eager for the sake of profit to de-industrialize, to offshore jobs, to offshore key strategic industries. And therefore, there's every reason to apply tariffs in order to bring those jobs back. I mean, the notion America can't do this or America's completely failed, I'm sorry. it's just not the case. I mean, I've said this before, I'll say it again. If tariffs are such a bad idea, why does China have tariffs? And China has not just tariffs, very stiff tariffs, but China has all kinds of non-tariff barriers. So if it's a bad idea for America to have tariffs, well, why is it a good idea for China to have it? So this is the point. Of course, tariffs make a lot of sense, and of course, using tariffs in order to encourage production, encourage, and particularly in strategic industries, that all of that makes sense. So if you're going to make a point of saying, "Oh, things are so bad, American economy is this bad," yeah, but that's the reason why somebody has to do something about it. And as I said about China, I'll say it again and again, China's position is simply unsustainable. It is absolutely unsustainable. You can't go on essentially suppressing domestic consumption in that way. It's essentially a policy of beggar thy neighbor, and using these trade surpluses essentially to wipe out industries in other countries and expect that no one's going to do anything about it. Of course they're going to do about it. And then when they do something about it, China's got a real problem. What the hell are we going to do with all this stuff in our warehouses that we can't unload on anyone? Because other countries are not going to put up with mass dumping. Anyway, Vic goes on. I'm not a particular fan of The Deer Hunter, especially. It's a great drama and an epic story, but to me, there was some propaganda elements too. Yeah, you could say that again. They made that whole thing about the North Vietnamese were playing Russian roulette. Even there's no evidence whatsoever that they did play Russian roulette, and particularly not with the uh, prisoners of war. So yeah, there were propaganda elements to it, and I agree with you. I mean, it was very well done, and quite and quite very powerfully done. I mean, I have to say those scenes of Russian roulette, they're quite scary. They really hold you, just that you can't really look away. Anyway, the way they portrayed the Vietnamese was a caricature. Yeah, absolutely. And the God Bless America scene, I'm not sure if it was supposed to be a bit of irony or a kind of cheap patriotic BS, in the same tone as the later Reagan era films like Rambo 2. Yeah, no, I mean it was better than the Reagan era films. I mean, those are just terrible. Those were Red Dawn and Rambo, and I mean, there was just so many of them. Um, and there was, which one was it? White Knights. And there was another one about, yeah, and fighting the Soviets and everything. Those were really lousy films in the Reagan era. So the Deer Hunter was better than those. But I agree that the tone was very much that. So it's very much good, decent Americans and corrupt, sleazy. It's not clear who was it. The Vietnamese were corrupt or the French. There's a kind of combination of the two. With but they were somehow corrupting the Americans. And as I say, Apocalypse Now has that theme as well. Somehow we're pretty good, but we lost our way. Which, and of course that's how they made Colonel Kurtz, the Brando character, that somehow he was this noble, idealistic person, but he was corrupted along the way because he suddenly realized that we can't win this war unless we get to be like them, like the North Vietnamese, because apparently they're just complete fanatics. They don't care about morality. They don't care about anything. They just grind out forever their victory. And so once he realized that that's the only way we can win, if we become like them, that's the moment that he became corrupt. I mean, there's never any thought given where you're in their country, you've kind of invaded their country, while you're moralizing and pontificating about them, but it's their country. Um, but so, the, I, um, uh, and then Vic says, would you compare the current PCR situation to that of the late Imperial Germany? Um, Not really. I mean, I think that late Imperial Germany was, I think, in a much more difficult position. I think late Imperial Germany really was in a tight box, not so much economically, but by having its adversaries around it. I mean, Germany is a very vulnerable in the way. I mean, China's vulnerable as well, but in a different way. I mean, Germany was very vulnerable territorially, very easily subjected to naval blockade, which is why they needed to build up their navy to avoid blockaded and therefore possibly starved into submission. But also they were surrounded on both on the two sides, on east and west, by enemies. France and Russia, which had actually formed a military alliance. So they look around and they said, "We got France and Russia; they're military allies against us, and then we've got the British, who are absolutely determined to be in a position to starve us into submission, and we don't really have too many friends on the continent. The best we've got is this ramshackle entity called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that's not very good. So the Imperial Germany was in a very tight spot in 1914, and and so you could understand why they needed to do something to break out of the encirclement. I mean, they definitely saw that they were encircled. Now, probably a more adroit diplomacy would have avoided the encirclement. And the same applies, I think, maybe to China. If they were more adroit, they wouldn't have got themselves into this situation that they're in now. So and it's interesting. I mean, similarities, I think, between the two. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Germany was the rising power, but China, yes, is a rising power, but the problem is that for China is that it's a long way from being in a position to challenge the United States. But China gave enough reasons to induce fear in the United States, and that's not a good idea. You want to keep your adversaries happy and complacent and so on. That didn't happen, and now you know, if they'd done that and said, look, we're not going to be in a position to challenge the United States for about 50 years, so let's just lower the tone, just keep everyone happy, be as friendly and as compliant as possible. But instead, I think China pursued a very defiant and arrogant tone and gave the Americans the sense that, hey, the Chinese they're about to overtake us. I mean, China, of course, isn't about to overtake the United States, but the Americans started worrying that they're close to it. So that's not a good move. And Germany in 1914 didn't see itself as a rising power. I mean, Germany saw itself as a power in decline. And that's the important thing to remember. I mean, Germany felt that if they didn't try to break out of the encirclement, they would cease to be any kind of a power at all. I mean, Germany had won the Franco-Prussian War 40 years earlier, but the Germans already knew that, that France that we defeated pretty easily in 1870, that doesn't exist anymore. France is now much stronger than it was in 1870. And the Russia that we've got to our east, that's not a backwater anymore. That's becoming rapidly industrializing, with railways and everything. Within a few years, we're going to be dwarfed by Russia. So Germany saw itself as a power in decline in 1914. So Judy, always very good to see you, Judy. Judy Hotchkiss, always a valued contributor, who has argued here, and I think quite convincingly, that the Americans want to move towards a new Bretton Woods system. I think if they have time, I think Trump and Scott Bessent would like to have some kind of a new economic and financial order, because what has happened now with this rise of, or at least these, since now this issue is now front and center, which is these unsustainable trade surpluses by China, and at the same time unsustainable trade deficits by the United States. That this somehow it needs to be addressed. You can't have this kind of beggar thy neighbor policies which have arisen. So I think there may well be some attempt towards creating a new Bretton Woods system. Because, I mean, I remember in the original Bretton Woods, it did try to address that very issue, that there wouldn't be, one country is always running a trade surplus and another one running a trade deficit, because then, there would obviously be a tendency towards capital moving to cheap labor areas, and so therefore capital moving out of areas where people have a decent standard of life. Clearly, they tried to avoid that, particularly Keynes, who was the mastermind of Bretton Woods. They wanted to avoid the situation where capital goes to the cheap labor areas, and then the areas where people live decently, they become run down. So Anyway, Judy says, but those people have governments that protect them from goods being dumped into their countries. The US has been the great idiot that has allowed it in the past, no longer. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, the US did it, and it was reasonable when they did it during the Cold War. They wanted to get West Germany and Japan up and running. And the only way they could do that is by essentially opening up their markets um, to, um, to their goods. So the U.S. was running very strong dollar, very overvalued dollar, and essentially their markets were just completely open to German and Japanese products. And of course, that policy should have ended once Germany and Japan were up and running and were now major economic powers. And the Americans did do something about it. So they devalue the dollar. They forced a revaluation of the D-mark, and so on. They did, and Reagan also tinkered around with quotas with the Germans and the Japanese in particular. So they tinkered with certain things, but it was never consistent enough and not determined enough really until Trump, because with the say look, we're now it's not just the trade deficit. We're kind of losing our supply lines, and we're not even able to assemble products from start to finish. I mean, it's like we're dependent again on our supply lines from our neighboring countries. We can't assemble a car in Detroit as we used to. We have to go to Mexico for this part and go to Canada for another part, and then we move at this stage of production. It has to be in Canada, and then returns to the United States. And hey, this is wrong. You've got to be able to do it from start to finish in the United States. So I think and these are strategic industries: auto industry, aircraft, pharmaceuticals, all of it absolutely should be in the United States, if you're going to be serious, if you're going to want to maintain yourself as a great power. Otherwise, you just become a kind of a financial center. Very nice. Some people do very well, but you're essentially not a great power. You're not a great and great power has to be a great industrial power. PRC, of course. Yeah, that's yeah. I understood what you were talking about. Marx 2020, George, how can the instigator America be the peacemaker? This is Trump's war period. Trump is no peace president. Ask the people of Gaza that America supplies the bombs, planes, and money. Then there is Yemen, bombs away. The thing is, I mean, that's not an unreasonable point. However, Trump does have a point when he says, well, this current phase of the fighting didn't happen while I was president. And if I had been president in February 2024, 2022, yeah, 2022, Russia would not have gone into Ukraine. Now, obviously, it's a hypothetical, and it may be true, it may not be true. I tend to think that it wouldn't have happened. And the reason why I think it wouldn't have happened, that I think Trump would have taken Russian concerns about security seriously. Remember, Russia in December 2021, they submitted those two draft agreements, one for the United States, one for NATO, about future NATO deployments and future NATO expansion, particularly on when it comes to Ukraine. And so when the Russians did this, I think Trump would have taken it seriously. I think Trump would not have just dismissed their concerns. I think Trump would have probably organized a summit. He might have organized an international conference, and something would have happened. I mean, it may have been fairly meaningless, but he would have done it. I think this what happened in 2022 is a consequence of Biden. I think Biden came in with a very hostile attitude towards Russia. Throughout 2021, he pursued a very anti-Russian policy. He called Putin a killer in a news interview. And then he didn't take seriously Russia's draft, ultimatums or whatever you want to call them. So the war is Biden's war. Yes, Trump sent the Javelin missiles and so on, but that's not the same thing. Yes, the Javelin missiles doesn't make Trump complicit in this war. This is Biden's war. It's not Trump's war. So I think he's reasonable to say, I want to bring this thing to an end. I want to end this, and I want to use whatever influence the United States possesses to bring it to an end. So I think that's fair. Gaza also, you have to say, it's still not Trump's war. I mean, it's still primarily it's Israel's war, and then Biden had, since 2023, it was on Biden's watch. It wasn't on Trump's watch. So in the case of the war in Gaza, I mean, Trump's case that it wouldn't have happened on his watch, I think, is a little weaker. But nonetheless, it didn't happen on his watch. It happened under Biden's watch. So, yes, he's providing armaments to Israel, is underwriting Israel, but it's still ultimately, it's Israel's war. He gives it to Israel. He gives whatever Israel wants. But what Trump does there is pretty much what every American leader does and would do in those circumstances, which is, hey, you give everything for Israel when it comes to the Palestinians. It's the only thing. Israel has carte blanche for the Palestinians. Israel doesn't have carte blanche when it comes to anything else. When we talk about Iran, then that policy is the United States. But I'm not defending. I think Trump's policy on Israel is entirely reprehensible. So I don't want to seem as if I'm defending Trump. It's reprehensible. And I'm not exactly calling Trump a peacemaker. But on the other hand, I mean, I think when it comes to Ukraine, I think he is trying to, affect the peace. I think even when it comes to, so far, I mean, in the negotiations with Iran over its nuclear energy, that's still, to get I think Trump is still entitled to the benefit of the doubt. I certainly have my doubts, but so far, he's entitled, rather than just simply dismiss it. Oh, of course, Trump is just going to bomb Iran or whatever. Maybe he will, but I think one should try to be fair and wait and see what happens. Anyway, and Marty, always very good to see you, Marty. Thank you very much, Marty, as always, for your generosity. And Robert says, in Milton Friedman's view, dumping is only a problem for domestic producers who can't compete, but it's a clear benefit for consumers and the overall economy. Instead of restricting dumping, countries should welcome cheaper imports and let market forces determine which firms survive. And then Judy puts in, Milton Friedman is an apologist for globalization. Yeah, I think that I agree. I mean, that's I mean, I tend to think, I've quoted him before. I thought Scott Besant made the point eloquently when he said, America is not, that's the American ethos is not buying cheap products. That's not what America's about. It's not like, poor people who need to go and buy cheap products. That's, it's America is a land not populated by poor people, but the American ethos is a land populated by people who are paid well, who have good jobs, jobs that they expect to last, and they expect to be getting a good income for the rest of their lives. So that it's not about going to Walmarts and so on and buying cheap crap. That's not the American ethos, and I think that, and the idea that somehow, it doesn't matter that you don't have a job anymore, it doesn't matter that your factories have moved out, but but you can buy uh, cheap razors and cheap hair dryers at the local Walmart, and that should keep you happy. That's not what it's about. What's about is produce. You have to produce something. You have to produce key industrial goods, because that's the source of your power, and you have to earn a good income. It's not just saying, oh well, it's okay. I don't really have a job anymore. I'm a waiter where I flip hamburgers, and but it's okay. Despite the crappy pay that I get, I can buy all this shit at these dollar stores. I it's not that's not the way anybody wants to live their lives. And to be honest, I mean, that Friedman's view is so 1970s and 80s. I just it's so quaint. I mean, the people used to talk like that in the sort of when there was the Reagan Thatcher years, when that's the way people used to talk. It just seems so antiquated now, particularly as people realize, well, what are the consequences of deindustrialization? What are the consequences of the countries that used to be the wealthiest in the world? They cease to be so, and jobs have moved elsewhere. That's not a good situation. So, but anyway, Robert, thank you for this insight into Milton Friedman. And Robert says, in Friedman's view, the right attitude toward China ought to be gratitude rather than fury for dumping. Yeah, that is Friedman's view. um, um, eh, all right. Um, Marx, George, you're missing the point. Trump wants to shut Ukraine down so America can deal with Iran, then China. America has overreached that's the real issue. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You may be right or not. I'm not sure that's exactly the case. First of all, we don't know how he's going to play out with Iran. I think that the jury is still out. The negotiations, so certainly there've been 2 rounds of negotiations that have been promising. But I'm not saying that they're going to work out, but at least they got off to a decent start. The China thing, it's not. It's not a military, and Trump knows perfectly well. China is not a military threat. China is an economic issue. It's about making money, and so as an economic issue, you have to deal with it as an economic issue. Trump has never talked about dealing with China in any military way, far less so even than Biden, who talked about going to war with China over Taiwan. Trump has never said that. He's never said Taiwan is somehow matter of great national interest for the United States. He sees China reasonably as a threat to the United States economically and industrially. That has to be dealt with on economic basis. So I mean, you're right in the sense that he wants to focus on that, because he said, I mean, there's no mystery here. He said it even in the truths that I read out earlier. This is a stupid war. There's nothing in it for the United States. Why are we getting ourselves into this? So many people are losing their lives, and it is obviously costing some money. What is the point of this? How does America benefit in any way from this? So he's saying that, but obviously he's saying, I want to focus on things that do matter for the United States. Now, he said Iran not having nuclear weapons is an issue that matters to the United States. I don't really agree with that. I don't see a big issue, big problem there with Iran having nuclear weapons. I mean, I tend to think when people have nuclear weapons, they behave prudently. As we were discussing earlier about India and Pakistan, both India and Pakistan, they haven't had any wars for more than 50 years. They had 3 wars in 25 years, 1948, 1965, 1971. They had 3 wars in 25 years. Now in 50 years, they haven't had any wars. I tend to think it's because they both have nuclear weapons, and they don't want to go down the path of starting a war, which could very easily spiral out of control. So I think nuclear weapons create stability, and so therefore, Trump says Iran can't have nuclear weapon. That's his view. It's not my view, but that's at least it's an arguable case. But that's still somehow, you can argue whether this is in America's interest or not in America's interest. Ukraine having this war on the European continent clearly serves no one's interest. And so that's why I think, Trump, who just says, I want to end this, is being very reasonable and very decent. I think one has to say, well, good. I think that you have to commend him for trying to bring it to an end. I mean, he may fail. I mean, there's a pack of people gleeful, hoping that he will fail, just like they hope that the tariffs will fail and that the Iran thing will fail. Everything will fail, which may happen. But I think he should be commended for trying to do something. Anyway, Robert says globalization is the process of increasing global interconnectedness through trade, technology, and culture. Yes, a free market is an economic system where prices are set by supply and demand with minimal government interference. Globalization often uses free markets to expand globally, but they aren't the same. Globalization is broader and includes social and political elements beyond just economics. Friedman cared only about the free markets. Well, that's right. But the point about the free markets is that, even Adam Smith himself was very skeptical about whether markets genuinely were free. And if they're not free, then all sorts of problems arise. And Smith, yes, said, oh, well, that trade benefits everyone. He says, so if one person produces ball bearings and then another person produces wine and then they exchange, so well, everyone benefits. But he realized that, well, what happens if one side makes sure that he never has to buy anything from anyone else, that he's only selling, but he never buys anyone else. So therefore, that creates real lopsidedness within the system, and then people are not benefiting. One side is benefiting because he's always selling, is always making money, but the other side is not benefiting. And so Adam Smith saw this, but Friedman, Friedman doesn't seem to, and that's particularly salient, as Smith, I think, saw it when we get to nation states, where if some nation states suddenly find, hey, we're continually being undercut by somebody. And there are all sorts of ways. I mean, it's not just tariffs, but all the different ways in which countries cheat with trade, whether it's intellectual property theft, it's whether you're subsidizing exports, and so on. So they all manner of things, all sorts of regulations that you impose. When you manipulate your currency, suddenly you drive down the value of the currency. There are all kinds of ways in which you cheat. And then when you're cheating, you can't keep saying that, oh, well, this is just free trade. And that's really the problem with China, is that nobody believes China practices free trade. The World Trade Organization doesn't think that China practices free trade. That's why China isn't going to get any allies to its side. I mean, the Europeans aren't exactly rushing. Yeah, let's join up with China against the Americans. I mean, you see these stories saying, China warns other countries not to side with the United States. How do other countries feel about China warning them as to what they should and should not do? And remember, China has used its economic muscle quite extensively over the years. I mean, I think Japan will tell you about it. Vietnam will, Australia will. So it's not, I know the media presenting China as these innocent victim. Yet another innocent victim. China and Ukraine. Zelenskyy and Xi Jinping, these two martyrs. Xi Jinping is about as much a victim as Zelenskyy. Marx 2023 says, thank God that you, George, are not advising the Kremlin. Russia has made clear the 4 regions are part of including the nuclear part. Great. Well, that's fine. That's fantastic. I mean, then keep fighting the war. That's okay. I mean, don't take my advice. I mean, it's okay. Go on fighting. Yeah, that's it. Keep doing it. I mean, that's see where that gets you. And it's quite likely that the Kremlin will not take my advice and will go on fighting a war for these 4 regions, which could take another few years to accomplish, bringing it under Russian control. Remember, even Kursk, when was it? August? So that's 8 months. So that's you're talking about now. It's about 9 months, almost 9 months since the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk. So it's 9 months. Russia still hasn't managed to drive them out. So this is going to be a long, slow process, and very, very casualty rich. This way this war is going. It's heavy casualties. It's not like the blitzkrieg type of war where things move very quickly and it's all over bar the shouting. So this is not at all the way it goes. That's it. When Marx says, NATO's a paper tiger, they threw everything they had, including the 24,000 sanctions. I said many times that NATO would not go directly to war with Russia. It was you, George, that said NATO could move troops into Western Ukraine. First of all, the war isn't over. I said it could happen. I never said that it will happen. I said it could happen, and the war is not over. So we don't yet know whether this will happen or not. So look, NATO has not even been bloodied. That's it. Russia has bloodied. Therefore, it's ultimately, if you can get somebody else, your adversary, to fight a war and to sustain huge casualties while you go on living your life of Riley and living in the lap of luxury, having excellent conferences, drinking fine wines, which is what NATO does, then you're not really a loser. This doesn't really work. Losers are the ones who lose. They get clobbered and they get their faces ground into the dirt. That hasn't happened. I wish it had. I'm I hate NATO, but I know all the tales of NATO defeat, NATO humiliation. I don't see the evidence for it. Anyway, Robert says, I first heard of Friedman by way of his Poppycon show on PBS. John Kenneth Galbraith's The Age of Uncertainty aired first broadcast in PBS in 1977. Milton Friedman's Free to Choose clearly intended to be a rejoinder to John's, followed in 1980. It's very interesting because Friedman had been he was this monetarist economist. He was a very specialized what he was doing. He wrote some book. I forgot the name of this book about money, but it was a very specialized book. It was highly quantitative, and and he got a Nobel Prize for that. And but then in later years, it was after that he became this guru of free markets. So he hadn't been up until then. Up until then, he had just been a monetarist. He was, he followed the movement of money. So he wasn't, this kind of essentially a Hayekian view of the world. I mean, he came to it late. I mean, Hayek was not a monetarist. Hayek wasn't particularly interested in on the whole issue of money. I don't even think Hayek even believed in money. I don't think he was even interested in money. I think Hayek and people like him, these libertarians, I don't think they even believe that there should be a kind of a national currency. I think there should be that everything should just be a very flexible trading system. In one place you can have direct barter, in another place you can have a kind of a local currency, and so on. So this was never an interest of Hayek's. But this is Friedman, and then Friedman became this guru of free markets, and that's what people read. People read that book, Free to Choose, but I don't think anyone read that tome that he wrote about the circulation of money, for which he won the Nobel Prize. Summer Petros, dear George. Okay, well, Summer Petros. Judy Hotchkiss says, don't you think that behind the scenes, any deal with Russia will involve a lot more than Ukraine? The US needs Russia in Iran, needs Russian uranium, precious metals, and needs Russian support for comprehensive monetary reform, either Mar-a-Lago or the new Bretton Woods agreement. I agree with you. I think that there probably are all sorts of things that are sweeteners that Trump is including in this. And that's why I think that it makes sense, if you're a leader of Russia, to think, that's it, let's just call it a day. We haven't accomplished what we wanted to in Ukraine. It's good. That's it. It's over. I mean, that's, if you're a head of state, you have to accept it. It's over. What we tried to do in 2022, we didn't achieve. This war, there's a kind of diminishing returns in keeping this war going. I mean, just more loss of lives, minimal gain of territory. I mean, it's like you just, I don't know how many people are getting killed, and for what? Just a few square feet a day. So therefore, it makes sense to say, well, here we have an American president who's ready to work with us, who's ready to extend the respect towards us, ready to recognize that we have security concerns, and these various other issues like extraction of minerals, energy, Arctic, and all sorts of other things. And Iran would also be, see if Russia can work on the issue of Iran, help to see if some kind of a denuclearization agreement can be worked out. So yeah, I agree. I think there are other things there, and that's why I think it would make sense for Putin and any Russian leader to say, this is as good as you can get. The next president will not be so friendly and welcoming to Russia, almost certainly. So yes, he might, the next president isn't going to stick to his guns, abandon this agreement, and so on. All that could happen, but this is the president you have, and you might as well use the opportunity to get it, because the absolute certainty, one can say with absolute certainty, whoever comes after Trump will be less favorably inclined towards Russia than Trump is. And then Summer Petra says, dear George, I'm also an Anglo-Hungarian. I will visit Hungary later in May. Maybe we could have a coffee and I could leave with a book. Is there any way I could get an email through to you? Yeah, sure. That's right. Yeah, I could leave with a book. I don't know what book. I mean, but absolutely, you can be happy to meet you. Absolutely. So yeah, yeah. Let me know. I'll give you my email. Or you could just simply, Where is it? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Or you can, yeah, write to me on Twitter or someone. So and then we can be in touch there. And then Vic says, since you mentioned the territorial integrity issue, in many podcasts you stated that Serbia should recognize the annexation of Crimea. All right, because Russia is Belgrade's only friend among the great powers, in my opinion. Since at this point Serbia's only claim to Kosovo is legal, it shouldn't step in front of it and undermine its own argument. Well, I mean, I think that I mean, it's a fair point. I mean that there'd be an inconsistency, but you could probably get around it by saying that Russia actually paid greater attention to to certain legal niceties on the issue of Crimea. I mean, they did have a referendum there, so they did consult the people. Then, in the case of Kosovo, Kosovo became independent entirely as a result of theft. I mean, this was basically NATO bombed Serbia into submission. NATO forced Serbia to disgorge Kosovo, and then when Kosovo declared independence, they never held a referendum. Um, so I think that if you're Serbia, I think you can say that, well, there really is no comparison between the case of Kosovo and the case of Crimea, um, and that's right. But primarily, you have to think in terms of Russia, because the all that would happen if you're Serbia is that would be taken to the bank and say, hey, look, even Serbia is opposes Russian on Crimea, without anyone actually saying, oh well, therefore we should show some respect for Serbia and Kosovo. Well, just as we don't really accept that Crimea had had a referendum and determined to be a part of Russia. Just so we don't accept that, we don't really accept that Kosovo seceded legally and that Kosovo made a free choice to leave Serbia. No one's going to do that. So they're going to pocket Serbia's anti-Russian stance, but without giving Serbia anything at all in return. So that's why I don't. Right. Victor says Serbia's recognition doesn't help Russia, and neither hurts it if it doesn't do it. So what's the point? Russia and Serbia will keep their relationship anyway, and Serbia's claim stays stronger about them without the move. Yeah, all right. I don't believe Serbia's motives for not recognizing are just trying to be nice to the West, as I think you presented. Serbia is, as I said, it's trying to be cute and trying to be consistent. There's no real consistency in its position. So I think that that look, you ultimately you have one friend in the world, only one. Nobody else is your friend. So if you have your one friend in the world, you kind of have to make sure that you try to keep him happy. That would be my advice, rather than try to play legal games. Now, it's true the Russians are quite forgiving and they're quite happy. The Serbs, a little brother, and they more or less are accepting. They don't like what Serbia is doing, but they accept it. I say, oh, yes, Serbia is a little country. It has to keep in with the West. But if you have only one friend, you should try to keep your one friend happy. And I think that Crimea is that issue on which, with a little bit of imagination, a little bit of intelligence, you can easily make a case that there's no comparison between the case of Crimea and the case of Kosovo, rather than say, in a facile way that, oh, the two are the same. They're not really the same. Um, uh, George, the falling dollar is raising borrowing costs that has to be funded by debt burden USA. Investors who bought treasuries at low yield are now losing it. The 6% drop is higher than inflation. You must know that. So, well, here's the thing. There's no problem here. Dollar goes up, dollar goes down, yields go up, yields go down. This whole thing of trying to guide major economic policy by what the market is doing on one day and what it's not doing on the other day. So you have the yields are not in any way a problem. I mean, there's just nothing. There's no crisis at all with the bond yields. I think they're very solid. Um, the dollar, yeah, the dollar goes up, the dollar goes down. Anytime the Treasury decided that this dollar has gone down a little bit too much, they go in and they will buy some treasuries, and as a result, the dollar will go up. You just want to be calm. You have to be calm about these things. The policy is not. These are major economic policies that we're talking about. You can't decide these things on these vagaries of the market. Oh, the stocks are going down. Oh no, I mean, it doesn't mean anything. The bond yields are nothing, not even remotely a problem. Value of the dollar going down, it's not remotely a problem. Again, the value of the dollar, it's good for exports, but if it goes down too much, then it's a very easy remedy for the Treasury to address. You just buy, you start selling treasuries. Everybody always wants them. There's no conceivable way in which anybody is not going to want to buy U.S. treasuries. Contrary to what you get on CNN, oh, nobody's going to buy treasuries. Yeah, right. And if you really believe that, so anyway. And then Judy says, on the other hand, expanded exports increase the tax revenue base, boosting budget and currency stability, of course. In the long run, what is needed is a comprehensive currency stabilization agreement, a Mar-a-Lago Accord or Bretton Woods. Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's always the case when you boost exports. That's good because it means your manufacturers are able to produce stuff that sells, and that means they're making money, and the workers are making money, and that builds, helps tax revenue. So, gotta just, take it easy. Vic says, check out the 1968 DDR documentary "Pilots in Pajamas." East German TV crew interviewing U.S. POWs. Okay, let me write this down. Pilots in pajamas. Pajamas. Okay, I'm going to check that out. And then Vic says, I read Apocalypse Now as more of a story about the corruption of the human soul in a senseless war situation. It shows the U.S. soldiers as savages. Let me go back to that. U.S. Soldiers as savages. I don't recall any particular Vietnamese antagonist or portraying the Vietnamese as worse than the American. Well, if you watch it and listen to the monologue by, because all of it is essentially goes through a monologue by the I forgot his name, the Martin Sheen character who's been assigned to assassinate Kurtz. He says this. He says this over and over again, that the reason why Kurtz became this liability is that he realized that the ethos and the military code of justice and the laws of war and all the standards that he was brought up on wouldn't suffice to defeat the Vietnamese. You know, I think something like these Vietnamese, you know, they just fight. They will fight. They eat rat meat. They don't care about their lives. They don't care about their health. They don't care about all of the things that we care about. So the only way that you'll be able to defeat them is to become like them. And so that's why he goes native. He essentially becomes a man in the jungle. He becomes like them. That's the point of the film. That the only way that's how he goes crazy, and that's why, in a way, the army decides they need to get rid of him. But that that essentially he's gone native. He's become Vietnamese, and he's done that because he doesn't think that America can win the war if Americans are guided by their kind of traditions and their ethics and their morality and their laws of war and their human rights doctrine. You know, that's not going to win you the war. That's why he goes crazy. All right. Okay. Vixen says, Karadzic once declared, we have only God and Greeks on our side. I didn't know you said that. We have only God and Greeks on our side. Yeah, Karadzic, you know, serving life imprisonment. Anyway, my time is up. So thank you, everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all of your comments and criticisms and questions and everything. So now we're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then we'll do a live stream on Monday, I hope, at 10 a.m. Eastern time, and then we're going to be back here for my solo at Tuesday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Please join me then. Until then, thank you. Good night. Goodbye. See you soon.